Welcome everyone to today's talk. The concept that I'd like to talk about today is what we might loosely call living from the head or living from the heart. So probably the best way to explain this, at least in my own experience, is to think of it like this. Ever since we were born, we have been conditioned in a certain way, whether it be by the culture or religion or country in which we grow up in, whether it be by the parents or guardians that have looked after us and nurtured us since we were babies and children, whether it were the friends that we have accumulated in our lives so far, and even to a certain degree the political framework or culture in which we live, all help to shape our identities, help to shape and condition the way we think, and therefore ultimately the nature of the thoughts that arise in our mind. Alongside that, we have all had various experiences since we were born that we have reacted to in different ways. And all of those experiences also helped, or hindered, we might say, to shape the way that we perceive and the way in which we interpret the world around us. So we have a relative relationship to the things around us through the conditioning of the mind and the way that the mind appears to apparently present that which is arising in front of it moment to moment. But by its very nature, conditioning and thought is limiting, because of course the minute that we have an idea or the minute that we adopt a belief system or a value system, it essentially ensures that we see the world through a certain lens or a certain prism, which makes it harder for us to potentially step outside of that prism or prism in order to be able to perceive what's going on perhaps in someone else's shoes. So this is the first part, which is that the person that you are now, to a lesser or greater degree, is a result of everything that you have experienced in your life so far, as well as all of the factors which have shaped and conditioned your belief systems, your mind, and also your attachment to your identity. And in addition to this, because of the culture in which we live, and I'm talking more about Western culture, which I think also applies in many Eastern countries today as well. So I just think we can call it that because I think we all know what we're referring to. That in Western culture, we're not really guided or taught about the fact that we can actually detach from our thoughts and perhaps see our thoughts not as really the only thing that we are. Certainly from my experience up until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I believed my thoughts. I thought I was my thoughts. I lived my thoughts. And as a result of that, I actually suffered a great deal, because it's only really when you go beyond the thoughts and you take a moment to say, hang on a minute, these thoughts are arising in my mind moment to moment, but I do have a choice as to whether I pay attention to them, because actually these thoughts are only as a result of everything that's happened in the past and all of my cultural conditioning. What would happen if I detach slightly from the influence that those thoughts have on my actions and the way in which I inform the way I live, and I'm able to step into a broader perceptive lens, if you like, or a broader perceptive aperture of what my life could be beyond just those limiting thoughts. So when we talk about living in the head or being stuck in the head, we're essentially saying that we are living attached to and identified with the thoughts that are arising in our minds moment to moment. That means I believe myself to be this, therefore I am that. I have this type of thought, therefore it must be true. I have this type of thought, therefore I must respond to it. And so we live in our heads, we act from our heads, and essentially we continue to reinforce and reinvigorate the patterns that have been laid down in our minds as a result of all of those previous experiences. Now, the problem with that is that almost all of those examples are external examples. It's where external factors and external circumstances have shaped the way in which we're perceiving things, and therefore, as a result of that, the thoughts that we're having. And as Buddha quite famously said, we are essentially the sum of everything that we've thought until we are able to go beyond thought, which is that last bit I just added myself. So what does it mean then in terms of liberation, or in terms of coming to a space of mental equanimity where we can actually come out of our heads and drop down into the heart space? Well, what we're essentially saying here is that if it's possible for a moment just to imagine that we can slow or perhaps even still the activities of the mind, which is what the Yoga Sutras talk so much about as being one of the kind of guiding principles of our yoga practice, is to realize that we can detach from thought, we can put down the mind, and when we do that, we create a spaciousness within us. We connect to something deeper within us, perhaps we might say in the heart space, and we begin to listen inwards for how we're feeling in any given moment, beyond the thought. And we allow ourselves slowly to tune into that guidance and what we might call that intuition, and to be led by it. Now, I remember a number of years ago, a friend of mine who'd been practicing meditation and yoga for a number of years saying, look, all you've got to do is listen within. And at the time, I just thought this was sort of some crazy nonsense. I was like, what do you mean listen within? I can't hear anything within, you know. And what I realize now is that my thoughts were so overwhelmingly powerful, and it was really the only thing that I was giving credence to, or that I was paying attention to, that I just didn't have the subtlety of awareness or even the understanding of what it might mean to put down the thinking mind and to listen to what was going on inside and listen for that guidance. It's only now, after having practiced yoga regularly for 7 or 8 years, that I'm able to tune in and recognize now what feels like an intuitive guidance, as opposed to something that's going on in my head, something that's going on that's being determined by the nature of the thoughts that I'm having. So when we talk about living from the head and living from the heart, what we're essentially saying is that, do we have the ability, can we make the choice to step away from the thoughts, to tone down or to turn down the volume on the thoughts, even if they're still there, and begin to listen inwards to notice whether what we're doing in our lives, to notice whether the way that we're responding or reacting to certain circumstances, situations, or people or relationships in our lives, can we actually tone all that down and listen inside to notice how we feel in those moments and in relation to those people and in relation to those circumstances? And when we do, what we might begin to notice is actually the external furniture of our lives may not necessarily be aligned with the way that we are intuitively being guided. And in my own personal example that I've talked about a lot before, and particularly in the first video on this channel, is the fact that for years I thought I was meant to be a business person and I thought I was meant to be an entrepreneur. And it was only after having some kind of practice and slowly looking inwards that I began to wake up to a slightly different reality, that actually all of those things that I was doing was making me feel anxious, was making me feel uncomfortable, was making me feel emotionally unstable, was affecting my health, was affecting my relationships, and so on. And gradually I began to recalibrate my life towards this goal of connecting to what I felt within and really prioritizing peace and mental equanimity over everything else. So that's when you come to live from the heart space. Now, it's not to say that when you try to drop down into the heart space, the head still doesn't get involved. It absolutely does. The ego is ever present, you could say, and finds its way into all sorts of things. So if you are competitive in business and you suddenly find yourself, like me, to be a yoga teacher, you're going to notice that competitive or that competition kind of edge of your character is still going to be there. But the difference now is that you're less identified with it, you're aware of it, you're watching it rather than reacting to it. And now when I notice it coming up, I kind of smile and laugh at it rather than taking it seriously and allowing it to engender even more competitive behaviors like I might have done in the past. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that we often mistake living from the heart as living from our emotions. And remember that emotions are merely a result of the thoughts that we have in our mind, getting what you might call secreted into the body as feelings and sensations. So when we talk about living from the heart, we're not talking about living from an emotional space. What we're actually talking about is, as far as I can understand it, is clearing the mind, letting the mind settle, and tuning in deeper and deeper and refining into listening to what our calling is, listening to what we might call as the dharmic act in any given moment. And the dharmic act is one which can serve ourselves, but also serve the whole at the same time. Rather than it being just a kind of selfish action, you might call it, it's one that serves each constituent part of the whole and the whole as well. And what we might find gradually as we begin to let go of our attachment and our identification to our thoughts, that we begin to ground into what we could call the heart space, what we could call awareness, and that we begin to notice that maybe the way that we feel here is not necessarily aligned with the direction in which our thoughts and the headspace has taken us so far in our lives. So although I'm covering this topic quite briefly, it is one that is quite profound, certainly for me, in terms of that distinction and the constant reminder each day when I notice myself getting stuck in my head, when I notice myself getting over-identified with my thoughts, over-identified with the things that I think to be that which I am, through meditative practice, through pranayama, through breathing, through asana, through living a bit slower, through taking pauses and breaks throughout the day, making compassionate decisions for myself in terms of the way that I spend my energy and so on. I find it easier and easier to connect to that heart space. And I would say that gradually my life is the attempt to recalibrate towards what that internal message or that internal guidance is taking me towards, for the benefit of myself, but also because I realize that through listening in that space, it gradually becomes to the benefit of all those people around me in my life as well, because essentially I'm less angsty, I'm less anxious, I'm calmer, I'm more present, I'm more steady in my outlook and so on. Whereas generally I found that when I've been over-identified with the mind and I've been over-identified with my thoughts, all sorts of problems and trouble ensue. So again, these videos are quite short in terms of trying to unpack some of these topics, but I hope you found it useful. Please do subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and maybe write a comment too. And also let me know if there are any topics that you'd like covered on this channel. So thanks once again for listening. Take care, and I'll see you all again soon. Namaste.